Jaws, the mystery of D.B. Cooper, America's most enigmatic hijacker. Welcome tonight. We are going to talk about one of the most captivating unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. The story of a man who called himself Dan Cooper, who would become known to the world as D.B. Cooper, and who, on a cold November evening in 1971, accomplished what no one had done before or since. He hijacked a commercial airliner, extorted a ransom of $200,000, parachuted into a thunderstorm over the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, and vanished without a trace into legend. The America of 1971. To understand the audacity and the context of what happened on that Thanksgiving Eve, we must first understand the world in which it occurred. The year 1971 was a time of profound transition in America. The nation was embroiled in the Vietnam War, which had divided the country more deeply than any conflict since the Civil War. The idealism of the 1960s had curdled into cynicism and disillusionment. President Richard Nixon occupied the White House, and the Watergate scandal that would ultimately destroy his presidency was already taking shape in the shadows, though few knew it yet. It was also a time when air travel was undergoing dramatic changes. The jet age had truly arrived, and flying had become accessible to the middle class in ways that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. But with this democratization of the skies came new vulnerabilities. The early 1970s represented the peak of what aviation historians would later call the golden age of hijacking. In 1969 alone, there were 87 attempted hijackings of American aircraft. The phenomenon had become so common that airlines began adding hijack insurance as an option when purchasing tickets. Most of these hijackings followed a predictable pattern. They were typically carried out by desperate individuals seeking to flee to Cuba, where Fidel Castro's communist government would offer them sanctuary. The protocol was well established. A hijacker would announce their intentions, the plane would be diverted to Havana, and everyone would eventually return home with nothing more than an inconvenient delay and a story to tell. Security at airports was minimal by today's standards. There were no metal detectors, no X-ray machines scanning luggage, no extensive security checkpoints. A passenger could walk directly from the street to the boarding gate, and no one would question what they carried in their briefcase or coat pockets. The Boeing 727 aircraft that would become the stage for our story was itself a symbol of this era. Introduced in 1964, the 727 was a marvel of engineering, a medium-range, narrow-body trijet that could operate from shorter runways and bring jet service to smaller cities. It had a distinctive feature that would prove crucial to our tale, a built-in air stair in the rear of the fuselage that could be lowered during flight. This design element, intended to allow the aircraft to operate from airports without jet bridges, would become infamous as Cooper's escape hatch. In this context of casual security and routine hijackings, no one could have anticipated that on the day before Thanksgiving 1971, someone would attempt something unprecedented, not an escape to Cuba, not a political statement, but a simple criminal act motivated by profit, executed with remarkable composure, and concluded in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The afternoon of November 24th, 1971. The day began ordinarily enough at Portland International Airport. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and the terminal buzzed with travelers eager to reach their destinations for the holiday. Flight 305 was a routine afternoon service, scheduled to depart Portland at 2:50 p.m. and arrive in Seattle just 30 minutes later, before continuing to Spokane. At approximately 2:00 p.m., a man approached the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter. He was unremarkable in almost every way, the kind of person who moves through crowds without leaving an impression. Witnesses would later struggle to provide consistent descriptions, their memories blurred by the ordinariness of the encounter. He was middle-aged, perhaps in his mid-40s. He wore a business suit, dark, conservative, appropriate for the era. He carried a briefcase as countless other businessmen did. He wore dark sunglasses, which no one found unusual in an era when such accessories were common fashion statements. He purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper, paying cash. The ticket cost $20. He checked no luggage, carrying only his briefcase and a paper bag. The transaction was routine, forgettable. The ticket agent who served him would later have only the vaguest recollection of the encounter. The man who called himself Dan Cooper proceeded to the gate and boarded Flight 305 without incident. He took seat 18C on the right side of the aircraft, in the last row before the rear galley. The Boeing 727 was far from full that afternoon. Thanksgiving travel typically peaked the day before, but by the afternoon of the 24th, the rush had largely passed. Only 36 passengers occupied the aircraft's 119 seats. Among the crew were Captain William Bill Scott, First Officer Robert Bob Ratazak, and Flight Engineer Harold E. Anderson in the cockpit. The cabin crew consisted of Senior Flight Attendant Florence Schaffner, Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow, and Flight Attendant Alice Hancock. These 6 individuals would soon find themselves participants in an event that would define their lives and launch one of the most extensive criminal investigations in FBI history. Florence Schaffner, working the aft section of the cabin, would be the first to interact with the passenger in 18C. She was 23 years old, professional, experienced despite her youth. As she moved through her pre-flight duties, the passenger in 18C handed her a note. In that era, such gestures were not uncommon. Lonely businessmen sometimes used flights as opportunities for awkward flirtation, slipping notes to attractive flight attendants with phone numbers or dinner invitations. Schaffner, accustomed to such attention and trained to handle it diplomatically, initially tucked the note into her pocket without reading it, offering the passenger a polite but distant smile. The man's voice was calm but insistent. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The words, delivered in a tone of almost casual matter-of-factness, cut through the ambient noise of the aircraft. Schaffner retrieved the note from her pocket. The message, written in neat block letters, was brief and chilling. "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You are being hijacked." Schaffner's training and professionalism immediately asserted itself over the spike of adrenaline that must have surged through her. She maintained her composure, her expression neutral, aware that panic could spread rapidly through a confined space like an aircraft cabin. She sat down in the aisle seat next to the hijacker, seat 18D, and in a low voice asked him what he wanted. The man opened his briefcase slightly, angling it so that only Schaffner could see inside. She glimpsed red cylinders, wires, and a battery, the components of what appeared to be an explosive device. Whether it was genuine or an elaborate fake would never be determined with certainty, but in that moment the question was academic. The threat was real enough. The hijacker's demands were specific and clearly thought out. He wanted $200,000 in $20 bills. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve chutes. He wanted the money and parachutes delivered to the aircraft when it landed in Seattle. Once these demands were met, he would release the passengers. His demeanor throughout this interaction was described by Schaffner as calm, polite, even courteous. He spoke in a low, measured tone. He did not raise his voice or make threats beyond the implicit one represented by the device in his briefcase. He ordered a bourbon and soda, which Schaffner brought him. He lit a cigarette, Smoking was still permitted on aircraft in 1971 and appeared entirely at ease, as if he were simply passing time on a routine flight. Schaffner relayed the demands to the cockpit. Captain Scott immediately grasped the seriousness of the situation. He notified Seattle Air Traffic Control, which in turn alerted the authorities. The aircraft's scheduled 30-minute flight was about to become considerably longer. The negotiation. As Flight 305 circled in a holding pattern above the Seattle-Tacoma area, a complex operation unfolded on the ground below. The hijacker's demands had triggered protocols that involved multiple agencies and corporate entities. Northwest Orient Airlines President Donald Nyrop, a former chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board known for his cost consciousness and attention to detail, was immediately informed. The FBI activated its Seattle field office. The Seattle Police Department mobilized resources. The clock was ticking, and 36 passengers sat trapped in an aircraft with a man who claimed to have a bomb. The demand for $200,000 was substantial, equivalent to approximately $1.4 million in today's currency, but not impossibly large. Northwest Orient, like all major airlines of the era, had procedures in place for such contingencies, though they had never expected to use them. The money had to be assembled in $20 bills, as specified. This detail would later prove significant. The Seattle First National Bank was contacted. Bank officials began the process of gathering 10,000 $20 bills. But there was a complication. It was the afternoon before a major holiday. Many bank branches had already closed or were operating on reduced schedules. The money had to be collected from multiple sources. Each bill's serial number had to be recorded, a process that, even working at maximum speed, would take time. The parachutes presented their own challenge. Why 4? The hijacker's reasoning would be debated for decades afterward. Some speculated that he wanted the authorities to believe he might take a hostage, which would ensure they provided functional parachutes rather than sabotaged ones. Others suggested he simply wanted backup equipment. Whatever his reasoning, the FBI had to locate suitable parachutes quickly. They contacted the Seattle Sport Parachute Center at Issaquah Skyport. The owner, who would later identify himself only as Chuck, provided 2 primary parachutes, NB-8 models designed for sport jumping. The FBI also obtained 2 reserve parachutes from a Seattle area flight school. These were older military-style parachutes, solid and reliable. All 4 were functional, none were sabotaged, precisely because the authorities could not be certain the hijacker wouldn't force a crew member or passenger to jump with him. While these preparations proceeded with as much speed as possible, Captain Scott kept the aircraft circling. Fuel was not an immediate concern. The 727 had been loaded for a flight to Spokane and had reserves beyond that, but neither could they remain aloft indefinitely. The hijacker appeared patient, however. He continued to sit calmly in seat 18C, occasionally conversing with Tina Mucklow, who had taken over from Schaffner as the primary liaison with the hijacker. Mucklow, like Schaffner, would later describe the hijacker as polite, soft-spoken, and seemingly at ease. He knew aviation terminology and appeared familiar with aircraft operations. When discussing the refueling that would be necessary in Seattle, he demonstrated knowledge of the 727's fuel capacity and systems. He chain-smoked Raleigh filter-tipped cigarettes, a detail noted because he left several cigarette butts in the ashtray, potential sources of DNA evidence, though such forensic techniques were decades away from practical application in 1971. The other passengers seated forward in the aircraft remained largely unaware of the drama unfolding in the rear. The crew had been instructed to reveal nothing. The circling was explained as a routine delay due to weather or air traffic. Some passengers read magazines, others dozed, and a few grew impatient at the inconvenience, unaware that they were participants in a historic event. At approximately 5:24 p.m., after circling for nearly 2 hours, Captain Scott received word that the ransom and parachutes were ready. He informed the hijacker, who approved the landing. Flight 305 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Captain Scott taxied to a remote, isolated section of the tarmac, away from the terminal as instructed by the hijacker. The aircraft's engines continued to run. The hijacker had specified that the aircraft should remain ready for immediate departure. A Northwest Orient employee approached the aircraft carrying a canvas bag containing the ransom money, 10,000 $20 bills weighing approximately 21 pounds. Another employee carried the 4 parachutes. The rear air stair was lowered. Tina Mucklow descended to receive the items. The transaction took only minutes. The bag of money and the parachutes were brought aboard and delivered to the hijacker. He briefly examined the contents, apparently satisfied with what he saw. True to his word, he then allowed the passengers to deplane. One by one, the 36 passengers filed toward the front exit, still largely unaware of what had transpired. They had been delayed, certainly, inconvenienced, but they were safe and would continue to their destinations on other flights. They walked down the stairs into the chilly November evening, grateful simply to be off the aircraft and continuing their holiday plans. The flight attendants Alice Hancock and Florence Schaffner were also released. Only Captain Scott, First Officer Ratazak, Flight Engineer Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow remained aboard with the hijacker. The flight into darkness. Once the passengers and 2 flight attendants had departed, the hijacker laid out the next phase of his plan. His demands were specific and revealed a deeper knowledge of aviation than the casual traveler would possess. He wanted the aircraft to fly to Mexico City. However, the 727 could not make that journey without refueling. Seattle to Mexico City exceeded the aircraft's range, particularly given the conditions the hijacker specified for the flight. He wanted the aircraft to fly with the rear air stair deployed, or at minimum, to have it unlocked and ready to be deployed in flight. He specified that the aircraft should fly at minimum speed. He mentioned approximately 170 knots, which was near the 727's minimum clean speed. He wanted the aircraft to fly at a low altitude, around 10,000 feet, well below the normal cruising altitude for a jet aircraft. He wanted the wing flaps to be set at 15 degrees, which would allow for slower, more stable flight. The landing gear should remain down. These specifications would later intrigue aviation experts and fuel speculation about the hijacker's background. He seemed to understand the 727's flight characteristics and to be setting up conditions that would allow him to exit the aircraft via the rear stairs during flight, a dangerous maneuver, but theoretically possible. Captain Scott explained that with these flight parameters, the aircraft's range would be severely limited. The low altitude meant higher air resistance. The deployed landing gear would create significant drag. The reduced speed would mean longer flight time and higher fuel consumption. They would need to refuel, probably at Reno, Nevada. The hijacker accepted this. Reno would serve as a refueling stop. From there, they would continue, perhaps to Yuma, Arizona, and then on to Mexico City. The specific route seemed less important to him than the flight conditions. At approximately 7:40 p.m., nearly 5 hours after its scheduled 30-minute flight should have concluded, Flight 305 departed Seattle-Tacoma International Airport for the second time. Aboard were 4 crew members, 1 hijacker, 10,000 $20 bills, and 4 parachutes. The night was dark and the weather was deteriorating. A storm system was moving through the Pacific Northwest, bringing rain, wind, and turbulence. The temperature at altitude was well below freezing. The conditions, in short, were about as hostile as one could imagine for what the hijacker apparently intended to do. The aircraft climbed to 10,000 feet and leveled off. Captain Scott set the airspeed at approximately 170 knots and configured the aircraft as instructed, flaps at 15 degrees, landing gear down, rear airstair unlocked. The flying was difficult under these conditions. The 727 was designed to cruise smoothly at 35,000 feet, not to lumber along at 10,000 feet with its gear hanging in the slipstream. The aircraft shuddered and bucked in the turbulent air. In the cabin, the hijacker went to work with the parachutes. He opened the canvas bag containing the money and examined the bundles of bills. Then he began preparing the parachutes. This process, as later reconstructed, revealed more intriguing details about his knowledge and intentions. He took one of the reserve parachutes, a military-style NB6 model, and cut open the container with a knife. He removed the canopy, apparently uninterested in its function as a parachute. Instead, he used the shroud lines, the cords connecting the canopy to the harness, to tie the bank bag securely closed. This improvisation showed practical problem-solving. The money bag needed to be secured for the jump ahead, and the reserve parachute provided materials suited to the task. He took one of the primary sport parachutes, the NB8 model, and put it on. This would be his parachute for the jump. The other primary parachute and the remaining reserve he ignored. Later analysis would show that the second reserve parachute was actually a training chute. It had been sewn shut and was non-functional. This fact has fueled speculation. Did the hijacker notice this and simply not care, using the functional primary parachute? Or did he fail to notice, suggesting perhaps less expertise than some theories supposed? Tina Mucklow remained in the cabin with him during these preparations. Her courage throughout this ordeal was remarkable. She was 23 years old, alone in the rear of a darkened aircraft, with a man who claimed to have a bomb, watching him prepare to do something unprecedented and dangerous. She maintained her composure, followed his instructions, and continued to serve as the communication link between the hijacker and the flight crew. The hijacker instructed her to go to the cockpit and remain there with the other crew members. He wanted to be alone in the cabin. As she prepared to leave, he handed her his tie clip and his mother-of-pearl tie pin, small gestures that added another layer of enigma to his already mysterious character. Were these mementos? Souvenirs? A strange courtesy? Or simply items he didn't want to carry where he was going? Mucklow went forward to the cockpit, closing the curtain behind her and joining Captain Scott, First Officer Ratasak, and Flight Engineer Anderson. The hijacker was now alone in the main cabin. At approximately 8:00 p.m., about 20 minutes after takeoff from Seattle, a warning light illuminated on the cockpit instrument panel. It indicated that the rear air stair was being deployed. Captain Scott picked up the intercom to communicate with the hijacker, but received no response. The aircraft's tail section dipped noticeably as the aerodynamics changed with the deployed stairway. The pilot struggled to maintain altitude and heading as the aircraft's flight characteristics suddenly altered. Minutes passed. The crew waited, uncertain what was happening in the darkness behind them. The aircraft continued south, buffeted by wind and rain, flying through the stormy night at 10,000 feet above the wilderness of southwestern Washington state. At approximately 8:13 p.m., the crew felt a sudden, brief change in the aircraft's trim. A slight upward movement of the tail section, as if a weight had been removed. They looked at each other in the dim light of the cockpit instruments. Had he done it? Had he actually jumped? They continued flying toward Reno as instructed, but now with growing certainty that they were alone on the aircraft. When they landed at Reno Tahoe International Airport at 10:15 p.m., a heavily armed tactical team stormed the aircraft, prepared for anything. They found the cabin empty. The rear air stair was still deployed, bouncing slightly in the aircraft's wake. The hijacker was gone. On one of the seats, they found the bank bag's canvas exterior, discarded. The shroud lines that had secured it were cut. 2 of the 4 parachutes remained, the training reserve with its sewn-shut canopy and one of the primary sport parachutes. The hijacker had taken the functional reserve's canopy for use as cord, and he had taken the other primary NB-8 parachute with him. The money was gone. The man was gone. He had actually done it. He had parachuted from a commercial jet aircraft during flight into a storm over the wilderness at night and vanished. The investigation begins. The FBI immediately designated the case NORJAC, an abbreviation for Northwest Hijacking. It would become one of the Bureau's longest-running and most intensive investigations, spanning decades and consuming thousands of hours of investigative work. The first challenge was determining where the hijacker had jumped. The flight had covered considerable distance during the time between the deployment of the air stair and the landing at Reno. Based on the time that the tail section's upward movement had been noted, approximately 8:13 p.m., and the aircraft's speed and heading, investigators triangulated a probable jump zone. The aircraft had been flying at roughly 170 knots at an altitude of approximately 10,000 feet. At 8:13 p.m., it was over the area of southwest Washington state, somewhere in the vicinity of the Cascade Range. The specific location was calculated to be near the Lewis River, north of Portland, Oregon, and south of Olympia, Washington. The terrain was rugged, dense forests, steep ravines, and in late November, likely covered in snow at higher elevations. The jump zone covered an area of several hundred square miles. Much of it was wilderness, accessible only by logging roads or on foot. The weather conditions on the night of November 24th had been severe: rain, wind, and near-freezing temperatures at altitude. Visibility was poor. The forest canopy was dense. For a parachutist, these conditions represented a nightmare scenario. Even an experienced jumper would find night jumps in poor weather extremely dangerous. Adding in the turbulence, the low temperature, the possibility of icing, and the challenge of navigating in complete darkness into unfamiliar wilderness terrain made the jump seem almost suicidal. Yet the hijacker had done it anyway. The FBI organized extensive ground searches of the calculated jump zone. Teams of agents, local law enforcement, and volunteers combed the forests and ravines. Helicopters flew search patterns. The media covered the story extensively, and soon people throughout the region were searching their properties and nearby woodlands, hoping to find evidence of the hijacker or his parachute. Nothing was found. No parachute, no body, no sign that anyone had crashed through the forest canopy on that stormy November night. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The investigation then turned to the question of identity. Who was this man? The name Dan Cooper was clearly an alias. No one matching the description of the hijacker could be found under that name. The fingerprints lifted from the aircraft, from the seat, the bourbon glass, and various surfaces the hijacker had touched, were run through FBI databases but produced no matches. Witnesses were interviewed and re-interviewed. The ticket agent who had sold the hijacker his ticket struggled to remember him. Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow, who had spent the most time with him, provided the best descriptions, but even these were frustratingly vague. He was a white male, perhaps 5'10" to 6 feet tall, mid-40s with brown eyes and dark brown or black hair. He wore a dark suit, white shirt, narrow black tie. He had a receding hairline. He might have had a mustache or perhaps not, Witnesses disagreed on this detail. He wore sunglasses at times. His voice was calm, unremarkable, without distinctive accent. It was, in essence, the description of thousands of middle-aged businessmen one might encounter in any airport in America in 1971. The FBI commissioned forensic artists to create composite sketches based on the witness descriptions. The resulting images were distributed widely, appearing on television, in newspapers, on wanted posters. Yet despite the massive publicity, no credible identification emerged. The name by which the hijacker would become known to the world resulted from a miscommunication. The hijacker had identified himself as Dan Cooper, a name that might have been chosen as a reference to a French-Belgian comic book series, popular in Europe, featuring a fictional Royal Canadian Air Force pilot named Dan Cooper. However, when the media began reporting the story, someone, the exact source of the error is unclear, referred to the hijacker as D.B. Cooper. The mistake was repeated, amplified, and within days it was the only name by which the hijacker was known. Despite the FBI's occasional corrections, D.B. Cooper had entered the cultural lexicon, and there it remained. Investigators worked methodically through various angles. They analyzed the evidence left behind on the aircraft. The hijacker had left 8 cigarette butts in the ashtray at his seat, all Raleigh brand, filter-tipped. While DNA analysis was not yet available in 1971, the cigarette butts were preserved for potential future testing. The hijacker had also left his clip-on tie, a black clip-on tie with a mother-of-pearl tie pin. These items were analyzed for trace evidence. Microscopic particles found on the tie included pure titanium and aluminum-titanium alloy fragments, rare earth elements, and other materials that might provide clues about the hijacker's occupation or environment. The bourbon, glass he had drunk from, bore his fingerprints, but these matched nothing in FBI files. The assumption was that if the hijacker had no criminal record, his fingerprints would not be on file anywhere in the pre-digital age of 1971. Investigators explored the parachutes. Why had he taken the military-style reserve and cut it open for cord? Why take a functional sport parachute but leave behind another functional one? The training reserve that was left behind, sewn shut and non-functional, suggested either that the hijacker knew enough to recognize it was useless, or that he had chosen the parachutes to take before carefully examining them all. The flight crew was interviewed extensively. Their descriptions of the hijacker's demeanor, his knowledge of aviation, and his specific demands were analyzed for insights into his background. Captain Scott noted that the hijacker seemed familiar with the Seattle area. When discussing the refueling stop, he had mentioned Tacoma, using local terminology. He had known about the 727's rear air stair, which suggested familiarity with that specific aircraft type. His specifications for altitude, speed, and flap settings indicated someone who understood aviation. This led investigators to focus on certain occupational backgrounds. Was the hijacker a former military paratrooper? The military would have provided parachute training and aviation knowledge. Was he a veteran of the Vietnam War? Perhaps someone disillusioned and desperate? Was he a commercial or private pilot? An aircraft mechanic? Someone in the aviation industry who would have regular contact with 727s and knowledge of their systems? The FBI compiled lists of persons of interest based on these criteria. They investigated countless leads from the public, people calling in to report suspicious neighbors, estranged relatives, former co-workers who fit the description. Every lead was followed, every tip investigated. None led anywhere conclusive. Suspects and theories. Over the decades that followed, numerous individuals would be investigated as potential suspects in the D.B. Cooper case. Some were named publicly, others remained known only to investigators, but each contributed to the evolving theories about the hijacker's identity and fate. One of the earliest suspects was a man named Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. In April 1972, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, McCoy carried out a remarkably similar crime. He hijacked United Airlines Flight 855, a Boeing 727 flying from Denver to Los Angeles, using methods nearly identical to Cooper's. He demanded $500,000, 4 parachutes, and directed the crew to fly at low altitude with the rear air stair deployed. He successfully parachuted from the aircraft over Utah and was arrested 2 days later. The similarities between McCoy's hijacking and the Cooper case were striking enough that many investigators believed they might have found their man. McCoy was a former Green Beret with extensive military parachute training and combat experience in Vietnam. He was familiar with aircraft operations, having served as a helicopter pilot. He was from the western United States and knew the terrain. However, significant discrepancies emerged. The physical descriptions didn't quite match. McCoy was younger than Cooper, only 29 at the time of his own hijacking. He was also taller and more athletic than the descriptions of Cooper. Perhaps most significantly, McCoy was at home in North Carolina, celebrating Thanksgiving with his family at the time of the Cooper hijacking, a fact corroborated by multiple family members and evidence. While some investigators continued to suspect McCoy might have been involved or might have been inspired by Cooper to attempt his own hijacking, most concluded he was not Cooper himself. McCoy was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in prison. In 1974, he escaped from federal prison and was killed in a shootout with FBI agents 3 months later, taking whatever knowledge he might have had to his grave. Another prominent suspect was Kenneth Christiansen, a former military paratrooper who worked as a purser and later a mechanic for Northwest Orient Airlines, the very airline Cooper had hijacked. Christiansen was investigated after his death in 1994 when his brother Lyle came forward with suspicions. Christiansen fit the physical description reasonably well, had parachute training from his military service, and would have had intimate knowledge of the 727 aircraft through his work with Northwest Orient. In the years after 1971, he had purchased a house and new cars, despite being on a modest mechanic's salary, expenditures that his brother found suspicious. On his deathbed, Christiansen had cryptically told Lyle, "There is something you should know, but I cannot tell you." Yet Christiansen also had significant discrepancies with the Cooper profile. He was much shorter than the descriptions, only 5 feet 8 inches tall, while witnesses consistently described Cooper as 5 feet 10 to 6 feet. His weight didn't match either, and investigators found no definitive evidence linking him to the crime, no physical evidence, no clear proof of the money's existence, no confession. In 2011, a woman named Marla Cooper came forward claiming that her uncle, Lynn Doyle L.D. Cooper, was the hijacker. She recalled a Thanksgiving gathering in 1971 when L.D. Cooper and another uncle had disappeared for the day. When they returned, L.D. was bruised and battered, claiming he had been in a car accident. Marla, who was 8 years old at the time, remembered hearing the adults whispering about the hijacking and warning the children never to speak of it. L.D. Cooper had military experience, had worked in the Northwest, and physically resembled the composite sketches. However, no definitive evidence could be found to support the claim, and L.D. Cooper, who died in 1999, left no confession or clear indication of involvement. Perhaps the most extensively investigated suspect was Robert Rackstraw, a former U.S. Army veteran with an extraordinarily colorful past. Rackstraw had served as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, had explosive ordnance training, and had parachute experience. After leaving the military, his life became increasingly chaotic. He was arrested for various crimes, including check fraud and later for attempted murder. He had lived in the Northwest at the time of the hijacking and bore some resemblance to the composite sketches. A team of former FBI investigators and forensic analysts, led by retired agent Tom Colbert, became convinced that Rackstraw was Cooper. They claimed to have found coded messages in letters sent to newspapers after the hijacking. Messages that allegedly pointed to Rackstraw using military codes he would have known. They argued that Rackstraw's military background, his demonstrated willingness to break the law, and his personality profile all fit the Cooper case. Rackstraw himself repeatedly denied any involvement, sometimes mockingly, sometimes angrily. He gave interviews in which he stated unequivocally that he was not D.B. Cooper, that he had nothing to do with the hijacking, and that the people accusing him were causing him grief and harassment. The FBI never filed charges against him, and no physical evidence definitively linked him to the crime. Rackstraw died in 2019, and if he had any secret knowledge of the case, he took it to his grave. Other suspects emerged over the years, each investigated and ultimately dismissed, or left in the realm of speculation. William Gossett, a former Marine and purported con man, was considered after he made suspicious statements to family members before his death in 2003. Dwayne Webber, who allegedly confessed to his wife on his deathbed in 1995, claiming, "I am Dan Cooper," was investigated but could not be definitively connected to the case. Jack Koffelt, a former convict with extensive criminal history, was proposed as a suspect by his family, but lacked concrete evidence linking him to the hijacking. The variety and number of suspects reflected both the enduring mystery of the case and the frustration of investigators. Each new suspect seemed plausible until examined closely. Each theory had its compelling elements and its fatal flaws. The truth remained elusive. The money discovery. On Sunday, February 10, 1980, more than 8 years after the hijacking, a young boy named Brian Ingram made a discovery that would reignite interest in the Cooper case and provide the first physical evidence that something, at least, from that November night, had survived. Brian, 8 years old, was on a family outing along the north shore of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington, about 9 miles downstream from Portland, Oregon. The location was an area called Tina Bar, a sandy beach on the river's edge, popular with local families for picnics and recreation. Brian was playing in the sand, digging to create terraces for a campfire, when he uncovered something unusual. Protruding from the sand were several packets of deteriorated $20 bills. The bills were badly decomposed, darkened and damaged by years of exposure to moisture and sediment. But the serial numbers were still partially legible, and those serial numbers, when checked against records, matched the ransom money given to D.B. Cooper in 1971. The discovery created a sensation. The FBI was immediately notified, and agents descended on Tina Bar to conduct a thorough search of the area. In total, Brian and the subsequent FBI search uncovered approximately $5,800 of the ransom money, 294 $20 bills, still bundled together with rubber bands that had deteriorated but held. The bills were in poor condition, having been submerged or saturated for years, but they were unmistakably part of Cooper's ransom. The discovery raised as many questions as it answered. How had the money gotten to Tina Bar? The location was not in the calculated flight path or jump zone. Tina Bar was approximately 20 miles west of the projected area where Cooper had jumped. For the money to have reached that location, one of several scenarios must have occurred. One theory was that Cooper had landed in the Columbia River or one of its tributaries, and his body and the money had been carried downstream by the current. The packets of bills, being tightly bundled and relatively flat, might have traveled along the riverbed, carried by spring floods and seasonal high water, until they lodged in the sediment at Tina Bar. Another theory suggested that Cooper might have landed near the river and attempted to cross it, losing the money in the process. Perhaps he had buried the money temporarily and it had been washed into the river system by rainwater runoff or spring flooding. A third theory proposed that Cooper had survived his jump but had subsequently died in the wilderness, and his body and the money had eventually been dispersed by natural processes. Animals scavenging, decomposition, and water movement, carrying different components to different locations. The FBI conducted extensive geological and hydrological studies of the Columbia River and its drainage system, trying to determine how the money might have traveled from the jump zone to Tina Bar. Geologists analyzed the sediment layers where the money was found, attempting to determine when and how it had been deposited. The results were inconclusive. Some geologists suggested the money had been at Tina Bar for several years, based on the sediment layering. Others argued it might have arrived more recently, washed down from upstream during a flood event. Further searches of the Tina Bar area and nearby beaches were conducted over the following years. Investigators hoped to find more of the ransom money, or perhaps Cooper's parachute or other equipment. Metal detectors swept the beach. Divers explored the river bottom. Nothing else was ever found. The discovery raised another intriguing question. Where was the rest of the money? Cooper had jumped with $200,000, 10,000 $20 bills. Only 294 bills had been found. That left 9,706 bills, or $194,120 still unaccounted for. Had Cooper successfully kept the rest of the money? Had it been destroyed by the elements? Was it buried somewhere in the wilderness? Had it been spent, distributed, hidden? The FBI had recorded the serial numbers of all 10,000 $20 bills given to Cooper. These serial numbers were shared with banks and law enforcement agencies nationwide. Despite this extensive tracking, not a single additional bill from the Cooper ransom has ever surfaced in circulation. No bank has ever reported receiving a Cooper bill. No business has ever deposited one. The money, apart from those 294 bills found at Tina Bar, has vanished as completely as Cooper himself. This absence of circulating ransom bills is perhaps one of the most telling pieces of evidence regarding Cooper's fate. If he had survived, if he had successfully escaped with the money, one would expect that over the following decades, some of that money would have been spent. $20 bills are common currency, easily spent or deposited without attracting attention. Yet none have appeared. This suggests either that Cooper died in or shortly after the jump, leaving the money to be lost or destroyed in the wilderness, or that he survived but chose never to spend the traceable money, keeping it hidden or destroying it. A discipline that seems almost superhuman given the financial motivation that presumably drove the hijacking in the first place. Brian Ingram, the boy who found the money, was allowed to keep a portion of it as a finder's reward, approximately 15 bills. These have since been sold at auction to collectors, fetching substantial sums as artifacts of one of America's most famous unsolved mysteries. The remaining bills are preserved by the FBI as evidence, along with the other physical items recovered from the hijacking: the parachutes, the tie, the cigarette butts, all waiting in an evidence locker for technology or information that might finally solve the case. The jump. Could he have survived? One of the most debated aspects of the D.B. Cooper case is whether the hijacker could have possibly survived his jump into the stormy night of November 24th, 1971. Expert opinions on this question have varied widely over the decades, with experienced parachutists, military personnel, and aviation experts weighing in on both sides of the debate. Those who argue that survival was unlikely or impossible point to the multiple factors working against the jumper. The weather conditions were severe: rain, wind, and turbulence. The temperature at 10,000 feet was well below freezing. Cooper was dressed in a business suit and loafers, entirely inappropriate attire for a parachute jump into a cold, wet environment. He had no helmet, no jumpsuit, no protective gear of any kind. The aircraft was traveling at approximately 170 knots, about 195 miles per hour. While this was near the 727's minimum speed, it was still dangerously fast for a parachute jump. Military paratroopers typically jump from aircraft traveling at speeds under 150 knots, and sport jumpers prefer even slower speeds. The force of the wind blast when Cooper stepped off the air stair would have been tremendous, potentially capable of causing injury or disorientation. The jump itself would have been extraordinarily difficult. The 727's rear air stair, when deployed in flight, trails behind and below the aircraft, angled downward by the force of the wind. To exit, Cooper would have had to work his way down the stairs against the tremendous force of the slipstream, then launch himself away from the stairs to avoid being struck by them or caught in the aircraft's turbulent wake. In the darkness, the rain, and the buffeting wind, this would have required remarkable strength and coordination. Once away from the aircraft, Cooper would have been in freefall. Sport parachutists in 1971 typically jumped from altitudes of 10,000 feet or higher and freefell for 30 to 40 seconds before deploying their parachutes. But sport jumpers wear altimeters, have training in freefall body position, and jump in daylight with clear visibility of the ground. Cooper had none of these advantages. In the darkness and clouds, he would have had no visual reference for altitude. Without an altimeter, he would have to estimate when to deploy his parachute based on time alone. A dangerous gamble. The parachute he chose, the NB-8 primary sport parachute, was a manual deployment system. He would have had to locate and pull the ripcord himself at the right moment, while tumbling through darkness and turbulence, possibly disoriented, certainly cold. If he pulled too early, he risked the canopy failing to deploy properly in the turbulent air. If he pulled too late, he would hit the ground before the canopy fully inflated. Even assuming a successful parachute deployment, the landing would have been perilous. The terrain below was mountainous wilderness, dense forests, steep slopes, and in late November, likely snow-covered at higher elevations. Landing in trees at night with a sport parachute is among the most dangerous scenarios a parachutist can face. Broken limbs, strangulation by tangled shroud lines, and being left suspended high in a tree canopy are common outcomes. Landing on a slope or in water would bring their own lethal dangers. If Cooper survived the landing itself, he would then have faced the challenge of wilderness survival. He was dressed in a business suit. He carried no visible survival equipment, no sleeping bag, no food, no water purification, no cold weather gear. The temperature that night was in the 30s Fahrenheit at ground level, lower at altitude. Rain was falling steadily. Hypothermia would have been a nearly immediate threat. Even an experienced woodsman would struggle to survive a November night in the Cascade Wilderness with no equipment. For someone already potentially injured from the jump and landing, survival seems even more unlikely. Yet there are those who argue that survival was not only possible, but likely. Several experienced parachutists have noted that while the jump was undoubtedly dangerous, it was not necessarily suicidal. The conditions, while poor, were not beyond what military personnel had trained for. Paratroopers have historically conducted jumps in adverse weather, at night, and into hostile terrain. If Cooper had military parachute training, as many have speculated, he might have had the skills and experience to manage the challenges. The speed of 170 knots, while faster than ideal, was not impossibly fast. While the wind blast would have been severe, it would not necessarily have caused incapacitation. Strong, prepared individuals can maintain consciousness and control through such forces. The parachute he chose was fully functional and appropriate for the jump. The NB-8 was a reliable system, widely used by sport jumpers of that era. If Cooper successfully deployed it and managed a controlled descent, landing in a forest would have been dangerous but not necessarily fatal. Many parachutists have survived tree landings, often with minimal injury if they're prepared for the possibility. Some have argued that Cooper's choice to cut open the reserve parachute and use its shroud lines to secure the money bag actually suggests expertise. It was a practical solution that someone with parachute experience might think of. His willingness to make the jump at all suggests either that he was confident in his abilities or that he was desperate enough not to care about the risk. Either scenario allows for the possibility of survival. The fact that no body was ever found is taken by some as evidence that Cooper survived. The search area, while extensive, was not exhaustive. Vast areas of forest were never searched. A body lying in a ravine covered by snow and forest debris could easily remain undiscovered for decades or forever. But the counter-argument is equally valid. If Cooper survived, where did he go? How did he walk out of the wilderness without being seen? How did he disappear without a trace? Over the years, various survival scenarios have been proposed. Some theorize that Cooper had accomplices waiting in the wilderness, perhaps with vehicles positioned on logging roads, ready to extract him once he landed. This would explain how he could disappear despite the extensive search efforts. However, no evidence of accomplices has ever emerged, and coordinating such a plan would have been extraordinarily difficult, given the variables involved: the aircraft's exact position at the time of the jump, wind drift during the parachute descent, and the navigation challenges of locating a specific point in the wilderness at night. Other theories suggest that Cooper might have landed in or near the Columbia River, which runs through the general area of the calculated jump zone. If he landed in the river, he could have been swept downstream, which might explain the money discovery at Tina Bar. But landing in a river at night, in cold water, wearing a business suit and carrying a heavy bag of money, would itself present severe survival challenges. The debate over Cooper's survival ultimately cannot be resolved with certainty. The evidence allows for both outcomes. The lack of a body suggests survival. The absence of any credible Cooper sighting and the complete absence of circulating ransom money suggest death. The answer lies somewhere in the dark forests of southwestern Washington state, where on a stormy November night in 1971, a man took a leap into legend. Nodro, the cultural phenomenon. While the FBI worked methodically to solve the case, D.B. Cooper's story was taking on a life of its own in American popular culture. The hijacker became, strangely, a folk hero, a trickster figure who had beaten the system, who had challenged authority and literally gotten away with it. In an era of growing distrust in institutions, of anti-establishment sentiment fueled by Vietnam and Watergate, Cooper became a symbol of defiant individualism. The story had elements that resonated with the public imagination. There was audacity and daring, hijacking a plane and parachuting into the wilderness. There was mystery, the unknown identity, the uncertain fate. There was a certain Robin Hood quality, perhaps unearned but present nonetheless. He had taken from a large corporation and had done so without physically harming anyone. All 36 passengers and 3 of the 4 crew members had been released unharmed. Only Cooper himself had faced the dangers of that leap into darkness. Books began appearing within months of the hijacking, speculating about Cooper's identity and fate. Journalists investigated, wrote articles, published exposés. Filmmakers were drawn to the story. in 1981, the movie The Pursuit of D.B. Cooper, starring Robert Duvall and Treat Williams, offered a fictionalized account that imagined Cooper surviving and being pursued by an insurance investigator. While not a critical success, it demonstrated Hollywood's fascination with the story. Cooper appeared in countless television shows, documentaries, and news specials. Every anniversary of the hijacking brought renewed media attention. The FBI's Norjack file grew to contain thousands of pages of reports, interviews, and leads. The case became a touchstone in American criminal history, mentioned alongside other famous unsolved mysteries like the identity of Jack the Ripper or the fate of Judge Crater. Towns near the calculated jump zone embraced the Cooper legacy. Ariel, Washington, a small community near where Cooper is thought to have jumped, hosts an annual D.B. Cooper Days festival every November. The event features a parade, skydiving demonstrations, Cooper lookalike contests, and storytelling sessions where locals share their theories about what happened to the hijacker. The Ariel Store and Tavern, a local establishment, displays Cooper memorabilia and has become an informal museum of the case. Collectors seek out artifacts and memorabilia related to the case. The $20 bills found by Brian Ingram at Tina Bar have sold at auction for thousands of dollars each. Northwest Orient Airlines issued commemorative plaques and displays. The parachute rig that Cooper didn't use, the tie he left behind, even the bourbon glass he drank from. All these items have taken on the aura of relics, tangible connections to an intangible mystery. Cooper's story has been referenced in popular music, literature, and art. The band 311 included a song called Stealing Happy Hours on their 1999 album that references Cooper. The rock band Aesop Rock mentioned Cooper in their lyrics. Writers have used Cooper as a character or reference point in novels and short stories. The image of the mysterious man in the business suit, parachute on his back, stepping off into the storm, has become iconic. Interestingly, Cooper's cultural impact has even influenced airline security. The hijacking was a direct catalyst for increased security measures. Within months of the Cooper case, the FAA mandated that all Boeing 727 aircraft be fitted with a device called a Cooper vane, a mechanical lock that prevents the rear air stair from being lowered during flight. This modification, purely a result of Cooper's hijacking, remained standard on all 727s until the aircraft was retired from commercial service. More broadly, the rash of hijackings in the early 1970s, culminating in the Cooper case, drove the implementation of universal passenger screening. By 1973, the FAA required all passengers and their carry-on baggage to be screened before boarding. Metal detectors became standard at airports. The era of casual airport access ended. While these measures were already being discussed before Cooper's hijacking, his case, and particularly the novelty of a hijacking motivated purely by profit rather than politics, accelerated their implementation. Thus Cooper, in a strange irony, both captivated the public imagination and inadvertently helped create the modern security apparatus that would make a similar hijacking virtually impossible. The very elements that made his escape romantic, the audacity, the simplicity, the ease with which he boarded the plane with his bomb, are now relics of a bygone era. Recent developments and modern analysis. In July 2016, the FBI announced that it was redirecting resources away from the D.B. Cooper case. After 45 years of active investigation, after following thousands of leads and interviewing countless witnesses, after analyzing every piece of physical evidence with the best forensic techniques available, the Bureau stated that absent the discovery of new physical evidence, it would no longer actively investigate the case. This decision was not an admission of defeat exactly, but rather an acknowledgement of reality. The leads had long since dried up. The witnesses, including the flight crew who had interacted directly with Cooper, were aging, and their memories, never entirely clear to begin with, were fading further. The physical evidence, while preserved, had yielded all the information it could with current technology. The investigation had reached a point of diminishing returns. However, the FBI maintained that the case remained open and that if credible new evidence emerged, the investigation could be resumed. The Norjack file would remain accessible. The evidence would remain in storage, and the FBI encouraged anyone with information to come forward. In the years since the FBI's partial stand-down, private investigators, amateur sleuths, and documentary filmmakers have continued to pursue the case. Advances in technology have opened new avenues of investigation. DNA analysis, impossible in 1971, is now routine. The FBI had, in fact, extracted DNA samples from the tie Cooper left behind, specifically from epithelial cells likely transferred when the tie was worn. However, this DNA has not produced a match in any database. Without a suspect to compare it to, the DNA remains merely a potential tool awaiting the right person to test it against. Metallurgical analysis of the rare particles found on Cooper's tie has suggested certain industrial environments where such materials might be present, possibly aerospace manufacturing or chemical processing facilities. These findings have led some investigators to focus on suspects who worked in such industries in the Seattle area in the early 1970s. But without a definitive suspect, even this evidence leads to speculation rather than solution. The parachute industry itself has changed dramatically since 1971. Modern parachutes are far more sophisticated, with advanced canopy designs, emergency systems, and safety features that didn't exist in Cooper's era. Experts have analyzed the NB-8 parachute that Cooper chose, examining its characteristics and capabilities. Their consensus is that while adequate for the task, it was not ideal for the specific conditions Cooper faced, but neither was it hopelessly inadequate. An experienced jumper might have succeeded with it. A novice almost certainly would not have. Geologists continue to study the Columbia River system and the Tina Bar money find, using modern hydrological modeling and sediment analysis techniques. Some recent studies have suggested that the money might have been deposited at Tina Bar as recently as the late 1970s, after being held elsewhere in the river system for years. Other studies maintain that the bills must have been there much earlier. The geological evidence, like so much else in this case, remains ambiguous. The passage of time has also brought a certain closure to some aspects of the case, even if the central mystery remains. Most of the major suspects who were investigated over the decades have now died. Kenneth Christensen died in 1994, Dwayne Webber in 1995, L.D. Cooper in 1999, William Gossett in 2003, Jack Koffelt in 2011, Robert Rackstraw in 2019. Their deaths have not ended speculation about their possible involvement, but they have removed the possibility of confession or definitive proof. The crew members of Flight 305 have also passed into history. Captain William Scott, who made the difficult decisions that night and flew his aircraft through challenging conditions to bring everyone home safely, continued flying for Northwest Orient until his retirement. He gave few interviews about the hijacking, maintaining professional discretion. He died in 2016, taking his memories of that night to his grave. Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow, the flight attendants who interacted most closely with Cooper, have lived with their memories of those hours for more than 5 decades. Both have given occasional interviews over the years, always describing Cooper as polite, calm, and seemingly rational. Mucklow in particular has spoken of the strange experience of spending those hours with someone who, for all his criminal actions, treated her with courtesy and even thanked her for her cooperation before sending her to the cockpit so he could make his jump alone. What really happened? After more than 5 decades, what can we say with confidence about what happened to D.B. Cooper? The honest answer is very little. The evidence allows for multiple scenarios, and definitive proof remains elusive. We know that a man calling himself Dan Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305 in Portland on the afternoon of November 24, 1971. We know he hijacked the aircraft, demanded and received $200,000 in ransom and 4 parachutes, released the passengers unharmed, and ordered the aircraft to fly toward Mexico at low altitude and low speed. We know that at approximately 8:13 p.m., somewhere over southwestern Washington state, he parachuted from the rear of the aircraft. These facts are established, witnessed, and documented. Beyond this, we enter the realm of speculation. The most fundamental question, did Cooper survive the jump, remains unanswered. The lack of a body has been interpreted by some as evidence of survival, by others as simply the result of the vastness of the search area and the difficulty of finding someone in dense wilderness. The discovery of some of the ransom money at Tina Bar in 1980 provides concrete evidence that something from that night came to rest far from the calculated jump zone, but whether it arrived there with Cooper or separately remains unknown. The complete absence of any of the other ransom bills surfacing in circulation is perhaps the most significant piece of circumstantial evidence we have. It suggests either that Cooper died with the money or that he survived but never spent it. The second scenario requires us to believe that Cooper, having gone to such extraordinary lengths to obtain the money, then exercised perfect discipline in never spending a single traceable bill for more than 50 years. While possible, this seems to strain credibility. Would someone who was willing to risk death for money then refuse to ever use that money? Yet the alternative, that Cooper died in or shortly after the jump, raises its own questions. Why has his body never been found? Why has his parachute never been recovered? The search efforts, while extensive, were not exhaustive, and the terrain is unforgiving. Bodies have disappeared in wilderness areas for decades, sometimes forever. A parachute canopy made of silk or nylon would have degraded over the years if exposed to the elements. If Cooper landed in water or thick brush, his equipment might have sunk or been buried long ago. If we assume Cooper died, we must then explain how some of the money reached Tina Bar while the rest vanished. The most plausible scenario is that Cooper landed in the Columbia River or one of its tributaries. The money bag, perhaps damaged in the water, could have released some bills while Cooper's body was carried by the current. The loose bills, lighter than a body, might have traveled differently, eventually lodging in sediment at Tina Bar while the body went elsewhere, became trapped in debris, sunk in a deep pool, or was carried all the way to the ocean. If we assume Cooper survived, we must explain not only the money's absence from circulation, but also Cooper's own complete disappearance. How did someone walk out of the wilderness after a nighttime parachute jump into a storm, travel home, and resume life without anyone noticing anything unusual? How did he explain any injuries from the jump? How did he account for his whereabouts that evening if anyone asked? And how has he kept this secret for more than 50 years? The possibility of accomplices could answer some of these questions, but introduces others. Accomplices would need to have been coordinated enough to position themselves correctly in a vast wilderness, to locate Cooper after his jump, and to extract him. They would need to have maintained absolute secrecy for decades. No falling out, no deathbed confessions, no indiscretion. While possible, it seems unlikely. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that we simply do not know what happened to D.B. Cooper. The evidence allows for his death and for his survival. It permits theories of solo action and of conspiracy. It invites speculation but refuses definitive answers. This ambiguity is perhaps the core of why the case has endured in public consciousness for so long. The legacy. What, then, is the legacy of D.B. Cooper? Beyond the immediate impact on airline security and the enduring mystery of his fate, what does this story mean? On one level, Cooper represents a moment when American innocence about air travel ended. The casual security of the jet age's early years was revealed as dangerous complacency. The Cooper case, along with other hijackings of that era, forced a recognition that commercial aviation was vulnerable and that protective measures were necessary. The inconveniences we now take for granted, the security lines, the screening, the restrictions on what we can carry, all trace their lineage back to cases like Cooper's. In this sense, every airline passenger since 1973 has lived in Cooper's shadow. On another level, Cooper has become a kind of Rorschach test for American attitudes toward crime, authority, and individualism. Those who view him as a folk hero see someone who challenged the system and won, who took from a faceless corporation without harming individuals, who demonstrated audacity and skill. Those who view him as simply a criminal see someone who threatened innocent people, who caused fear and disruption, whose actions led to decades of invasive security measures. Both views contain elements of truth. The case also represents something about the nature of mystery itself and our cultural relationship with the unknown. In an age of unprecedented information access, of surveillance cameras and digital footprints, of DNA databases and facial recognition, the idea that someone could simply vanish and remain unidentified for decades holds a certain appeal. Cooper represents the possibility of escape, of transformation, of leaving one life behind and starting another. Whether or not he actually achieved this, the possibility itself resonates. For the investigators who worked the case, for the crew members who lived through it, for the families of suspects who were investigated and cleared, or who died with suspicion still hanging over them, Cooper represents something else entirely, an unsolved puzzle, an unfinished chapter, justice deferred. The FBI agents who spent years pursuing leads, conducting interviews, and analyzing evidence never got the satisfaction of definitive resolution. The case file, thousands of pages thick, remains open but dormant. For the small communities near the supposed jump zone, Cooper has become part of local identity. The annual festivals, the tourist traffic, the speculation, these have woven Cooper into the fabric of regional history. He has become, in a sense, a ghost that haunts the Pacific Northwest, a presence felt in the forests and mountains, in the stories told in taverns and around campfires. Conclusion: the man who fell to earth. On this quiet evening, as we draw our story to a close, we return to where it began. To that moment at approximately 8:13 p.m. on November 24, 1971, when a man in a business suit, carrying a bag full of $20 bills, stepped off the rear air stair of a Boeing 727 and disappeared into a stormy night. Everything that came before that moment, the careful planning, the airport approach, the calm execution of the hijacking, the negotiation, the specific demands, all of it led to those few seconds when Dan Cooper, or whatever his real name was, took his leap into history. Everything that came after, the massive investigation, the decades of speculation, the cultural phenomenon, the enduring mystery, all of it flows from that single act. In those seconds, as he fell away from the aircraft and into the darkness, Cooper was suspended between two worlds. Behind him was civilization, order, law, identity, all the structures and systems he was leaving behind. Below him was wilderness, Chaos, the unknown, perhaps freedom, perhaps death, perhaps simply oblivion. The storm swallowed him, and he was gone. More than 5 decades later, we still do not know which world claimed him. Did he land safely and walk away, somehow managing to disappear, completely into a new life? Did he die in the jump or shortly after, his body becoming part of the forest, slowly returning to the earth? Did something else happen, something we haven't imagined in all our theorizing and speculation? The truth is that Dan Cooper, D.B. Cooper, exists now more as idea than as person. He has transcended his physical reality, whatever that was, to become a symbol, a story, a mystery that speaks to something in the American psyche. He is the possibility of escape, the romance of the unknown, the last successful hijacker, the man who beat the system and got away, or perhaps the cautionary tale of ambition and daring gone wrong, of a plan that led only to a cold death in the wilderness. The Boeing 727 that carried him that night, tail number N467US, continued flying for Northwest Orient for many years after. It was eventually retired from service, and in a fitting end to its story, it was scrapped. But the memory of what happened aboard that aircraft on that November evening endures. The case file remains open. The evidence sits in storage. And somewhere, perhaps, in a ravine in the Cascade Mountains, or in the sediment of the Columbia River, or in a place we haven't thought to look, the final pieces of the puzzle lie waiting. The forest keeps its secrets. The river flows on. And the man who called himself Dan Cooper remains what he became on that stormy night. A ghost in the machine, a riddle without answer, a story without end. We may never know what truly happened to D.B. Cooper, but perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. Perhaps the value lies not in the solution, but in the question itself, in what we reveal about ourselves in our attempts to solve it, in the stories we tell while we wonder. And so we leave our story here on this November evening, with a man stepping into darkness and disappearing into legend. Wherever the truth lies, in a forest grave, in a secret life. Successfully lived, or in some scenario none of us have imagined, D.B. Cooper has earned his place in history not by what we know about him, but by what we do not know, and perhaps never will. The mystery endures. The story continues. And somewhere in the American imagination, D.B. Cooper is still falling through that dark November sky, suspended forever in those few seconds between the aircraft and the unknown, between the law he defied and the fate that claimed him, between the person he was and the legend he became. This is his story, or as much of it as we can tell. The rest, like the man himself, remains lost in the storm.